The smell hit Detective Vince Donovan first. It was a chemical cocktail of turpentine, aerosol paint, and something else. Something coppery and sweet that clung to the back of his throat. It was the smell of creation violently interrupted by the smell of decay. The Gilded Cage Art Collective occupied a resurrected warehouse in Atlanta's Old Fourth Ward, a neighborhood caught in a tug-of-war between its gritty past and a gentrified future. Tonight, the past was winning. The victim was centered in the room as if she were her own final art installation. Amara Mara Sinclair, 24 years old, lay on a paint-splattered canvas dropcloth, her limbs askew in a way that defied the grace she was known for. Her life's vibrant colors, the deep magenta of her dress, the turquoise streaks in her braided hair, were now muted by the encroaching crimson stain. Donovan's gaze drifted from the body to the wall behind her. A crude graffiti tag, the coiled serpent of the East Side Vipers, was freshly sprayed in the angry black paint. Next to her hand, almost comically placed, was a small baggie of white powder. "Looks open and shut, Vince," said a uniformed officer, his voice too loud for the sanctity of the scene. "A deal gone bad. The Vipers don't play." Donovan grunted, his eyes scanning the cavernous space. The studio was a beautiful mess, a testament to a mind that saw the world in ways he never could. Canvases leaned against exposed brick walls, some filled with explosive abstract figures, others with hauntingly delicate portraits. Jars of brushes stood like bouquets on wobbly tables. Everything spoke of life, of passion, of a story in motion. Everything except the brutal final period that was Amara Sinclair's body. It didn't feel like a gang hit. Gang hits were messy but functional. This felt staged. The graffiti was too crisp, the bag of drugs too obvious, like a prop from a bad TV show. His partner, Officer Gabrielle Monroe, was quieter. She moved with a deliberate grace that contrasted with Donovan's weary shuffle. Her gaze wasn't on the obvious clues, but on the periphery. She studied a half-finished painting on an easel, a piece depicting a bird breaking free from a gilded cage, its golden bars shattering into 1,000 pieces. "Her husband's on his way," Monroe said, her voice a low murmur. "Julian Sinclair." Donovan's head snapped up. Julian Sinclair, the golden boy of Atlanta politics, a charismatic community activist on the fast track to a city council seat, maybe even the mayor's office one day. He was the face of the new Atlanta, successful, articulate, a man who had pulled himself up and was promising to bring the rest of the community with him. He and Amara were the city's power couple, a perfect blend of political ambition and artistic soul, or so the Sunday papers said. "This just went from a back-page story to the front page," Donovan muttered, running a hand over his tired face. A case like this, with a high-profile husband, meant press conferences, pressure from the chief, and no room for error. It meant his comfortable, cynical routine was about to be blown apart. He knelt, careful not to disturb anything, and looked closer at Amara. There was a defensive wound on her forearm, a deep gash that suggested she'd fought back. She wasn't a passive victim, she was a fighter. He glanced back at the graffiti serpent on the wall. It felt like a deliberate misdirection, a cheap magic trick designed to draw the audience's eye while the real action happened somewhere else. As the forensics team began their meticulous work, their white suits moving like ghosts through the chaos of Amara's studio, Donovan felt a familiar knot tighten in his stomach. This wasn't a simple story of a good girl getting mixed up with bad people. The air was thick with unspoken secrets, with the ghost of a symphony that had been silenced before its final crescendo. The obvious answer was the East Side Vipers, a neat little box to put the tragedy in. But Donovan had learned long ago that in a city like Atlanta, the most dangerous snakes didn't always have fangs. Sometimes they wore $1,000 suits and smiled for the cameras. And as he heard the wail of an approaching motorcade, he had a sinking feeling he was about to meet one. The performance was about to begin. Julian Sinclair did not arrive like a grieving husband. He arrived like a head of state visiting a disaster zone. A black Lincoln Navigator swept into the cordoned-off street, and he emerged, flanked by two aides who acted as human shields against the already gathering media vultures. He was tall, immaculate in a tailored charcoal suit, his face a mask of perfectly sculpted grief. Donovan and Monroe met him at the police tape. Mr. Sinclair, I'm Detective Donovan. This is Officer Monroe. I'm deeply sorry for your loss. Julian nodded, his eyes glistening under the harsh glare of the police lights. He seemed to look right through them, his gaze fixed on the warehouse that held his wife's body. Can I see her? His voice was a hoarse whisper, raw with a pain that felt almost too cinematic to be real. That's not a good idea right now, sir, Donovan said gently. The scene is still being processed. Julian's shoulders slumped. He allowed one of his aides to place a comforting hand on his back. I don't understand, he said, his voice cracking. She was just painting. She loved this place. It was her sanctuary. He looked at Donovan, his eyes pleading. The officer on the phone mentioned gangs, drugs. He said the words as if they were foreign, objects he couldn't comprehend. We're looking into every possibility, Mr. Sinclair, Monroe interjected, her tone professional, but her eyes sharp, analytical. The next morning, Julian Sinclair proved he was a master of turning tragedy into political theater. Standing on the steps of his stately Buckhead home, a somber portrait of Amara on an easel beside him, he addressed a sea of microphones. He didn't just mourn his wife, he eulogized her as a symbol. My wife, Amara, was a beacon of light, he began, his voice trembling but resolute. She saw beauty in the forgotten corners of our city. But last night, the darkness that we have allowed to fester in those corners reached out and extinguished that light. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. The plague of gang violence and the poison of drugs on our streets are not abstract issues. They are not statistics. Last night, they became a monster that broke into my home and stole my heart. He was brilliant. He seamlessly wove his personal loss into his political platform. He wasn't just a widower, he was a warrior, a man whose pain would now fuel his crusade to take back our city. The public wept with him. Donations poured into his campaign. He was no longer just a candidate, he was a martyr. Monroe watched the press conference on her phone back at the precinct, her expression unreadable. He's good, she said, more to herself than to Donovan. He's a politician, Donovan grunted, sifting through the preliminary forensics report. Spin is what they do. This is more than spin, Vince, she countered. He's not just telling a story, he's writing the ending. He's already told the entire city who the killer is. He's making it impossible for it to be anyone else. That afternoon, they visited the Sinclair home to ask some follow-up questions. The house was a monument to sterile success, gray walls, minimalist furniture, and large, abstract art pieces that felt more like investments than expressions of joy. The only warmth came from a small, cluttered room off the main living area. It was Amara's home office. Unlike the rest of the house, it was filled with books of poetry, half-written verses on scattered notebooks, and photos of her with a group of vibrant, laughing friends. None of the photos included Julian. When was the last time you saw your wife, Mr. Sinclair? Donovan asked, his pen poised over his notepad. Yesterday morning, she was heading to the studio early. She had a burst of inspiration. He gestured vaguely around the pristine living room. I told her to be careful. That neighborhood, it's changing, but it's not safe yet. She was so trusting. He was painting a picture of her as a naive, fragile artist who had wandered into a dangerous world she didn't understand. Did she have any enemies? Anyone who might wish her harm? Monroe asked, her eyes fixed on him. Julian let out a short, bitter laugh. Only the demons she was trying to save, the people she offered a hand to who would rather bite it. She was an artist. Her only enemy was ugliness. He was flawless. His answers were airtight, his grief palpable. But as they were leaving, Monroe noticed something. On a side table, partially hidden beneath a stack of architectural magazines, was a framed photo. It was Julian and Amara on their wedding day, smiling. But Julian's hand was gripping her arm just a little too tightly, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. It was a flicker of possession, a hint of something cold beneath the polished surface. To anyone else, it was a picture of a happy couple. To Monroe, it was the first sign that the gilded cage Amara was trying to escape in her paintings might not have been a metaphor after all. It might have been her own home. The investigation fractured, splitting down the lines of its two lead detectives. Donovan, a man who trusted instincts honed by decades of street-level police work, followed the trail Julian Sinclair had so conveniently laid out. He dove into the world of the East Side Vipers. It was a grim, predictable dance, kicking down doors of known flop houses, leaning on informants, and spending hours in interrogation rooms that smelled of stale sweat and desperation. He was chasing the coiled serpent. He finally cornered the Viper's reputed leader, a man named Hector Hex Ramirez, in the back of a smoky pool hall. Hex was a man whose face was a roadmap of bad decisions, but his eyes were sharp and intelligent. "I heard about the artist," Hex said before Donovan could even flash his badge. "Tragic, but it wasn't us." "Your tag was on the wall, Hex," Donovan said, his voice low and threatening. Hex took a long drag from his cigarette, letting the smoke curl from his nostrils. "Anyone can buy a can of Krylon, detective. My guys, they're not subtle. If we do a job, you know it's us. We don't leave props. Drugs, a tag, that's TV cop stuff. That's an insult to our professionalism." He leaned forward, his voice dropping. "Besides, that warehouse district, that's our quiet zone. We don't mess where the new money is moving in. Bad for business." He seemed genuinely baffled, almost offended, that his crew would be linked to something so clumsy. Donovan left with nothing but the bitter taste of stale smoke and the unsettling feeling that the career criminal was telling the truth. Meanwhile, Gabrielle Monroe took the opposite path. She wasn't chasing the serpent, she was trying to understand the bird. She returned to the Gilded Cage Art Collective, not as a cop, but as a quiet observer. The space was now a shrine. Friends of Amara had gathered, lighting candles and sharing stories. The air was thick with genuine grief, a stark contrast to the performative sorrow at the Sinclair residence. Monroe spoke to a sculptor named Lena, a woman with clay under her fingernails and fire in her eyes. "Julian talks about her like she was this fragile little flower," Lena said, her voice laced with anger. "Mara was a storm. She was brilliant and fierce. He never understood that. He didn't want to." Another friend, a poet named David, elaborated. "Julian saw her art as a cute hobby, something to be mentioned at fundraisers to make him seem more cultured. He hated it when she started getting real recognition." Monroe felt a chill. "What do you mean?" "Last year, a publisher from New York wanted to sign her for a 2-book deal. It was her dream, a national tour, everything. Julian talked her out of it." David shook his head in disgust. He said it would be a distraction during his campaign. Said the bohemian lifestyle of a touring poet wouldn't reflect well on a future councilman's wife. He didn't ask her to postpone it. He convinced her she wasn't good enough, that she'd fail and embarrass him. The portrait they painted was of a slow, methodical suffocation. He controlled her finances under the guise of managing their future. He isolated her from friends he deemed unambitious. He praised her in public, but chipped away at her confidence in private. The gilded cage in her paintings wasn't just a metaphor. It was a diary. "Was she seeing someone else?" Monroe asked softly. Lena and David exchanged a look. "She was finding her voice again," Lena said carefully. "She met someone who heard her, someone who saw the storm and wasn't afraid of the rain." They wouldn't give a name, not yet. There was a fear that lingered, a sense that the powerful man who had controlled Amara in life might still be able to harm those she cared about in death. But they had given Monroe the most crucial piece of the puzzle, a motive. It wasn't about a drug deal gone wrong. It was about a bird that had finally learned how to sing again, just as she was about to fly away. Julian hadn't lost a wife to gang violence. He was about to lose a prized possession. Back at the precinct, Donovan slammed his files on the desk. "The Vipers are a dead end. Every informant I have says they're clean on this." Monroe looked up from her notes, her expression calm but intense. "That's because we've been looking in the wrong cage, Vince. The monster wasn't on the street. I think it was waiting for her at home." Donovan stared at her, the city's golden boy on one side, a street gang on the other. For the first time, he felt the foundation of his case begin to crumble. He was holding a detailed map that was leading him absolutely nowhere, while Monroe, with no map at all, seemed to be getting closer to the truth. Just as Donovan's investigation was hitting a brick wall, a lifeline appeared. An anonymous tip, called in from a payphone at a downtown MARTA station, was patched through to his desk. The voice was muffled, male, and nervous. "You're looking for who killed that artist girl?" the voice rasped. "You should check out her boyfriend, some music producer dude. Eli Reed, lives over in Cabbagetown. He's bad news. Got her hooked on stuff. They were fighting. The line went dead. It was exactly what Donovan needed. A name. A connection to the victim outside her polished life with Julian. Eli Reed. A quick search of the database brought up a minor possession charge from 5 years ago. A youthful mistake. But in a murder investigation, it was a red flag the size of a billboard. Donovan and a small tactical team descended on Eli's apartment. A cramped but creative space above a record shop. The contrast with the Sinclair mansion was jarring. The air smelled of vinyl records, incense, and stale coffee. Music equipment covered every surface, and lyrics were scribbled on a whiteboard that dominated one wall. When they kicked in the door, Eli was in the middle of composing a beat, headphones clamped over his ears. He was so lost in his music that he didn't even hear them until a shotgun was racked in his living room. Fear, raw and pure, flashed in his eyes. He was a lanky young man with thoughtful eyes and hands that looked like they were made for a mixing board, not a weapon. He was immediately profoundly out of his depth. The search was quick and efficient, and damningly successful. Tucked away in a closet, behind a stack of vintage album covers, they found it. A half-empty can of black Krylon spray paint. The forensics tech on site did a quick nozzle comparison. It was a potential match to the graffiti at the crime scene. In a kitchen drawer, beneath a bag of rice, they found another small baggie of powder, the same type found next to Amara's body. "It's too perfect," Monroe whispered to Donovan as they watched Eli being cuffed. "Or it's just the truth," Donovan retorted, though even he felt a prickle of doubt. It was clean. Too clean. Like finding a signed confession and the murder weapon gift-wrapped on the suspect's doorstep. Eli was frantic. "I didn't do this. I loved her. You have to believe me." His pleas were drowned out by the reading of his Miranda rights. The media, tipped off by an anonymous source that was almost certainly within the police department or Julian Sinclair's camp, was waiting outside. The cameras flashed as Eli, looking terrified and guilty, was shoved into the back of a squad car. The narrative was set in stone within minutes. The headlines practically wrote themselves. Aspiring musician arrested in artist's murder. Victim's secret lover had violent past. Politician's wife dragged into a world of drugs and deceit. Julian Sinclair, when asked for a comment, delivered another masterful performance. He spoke of his shock and profound sadness that Amara had been manipulated by such a dangerous individual. He praised the Atlanta Police Department for their swift action. He had been vindicated. His story, the one he had presented from day one, was now the official truth. In the interrogation room, Eli was a mess of grief and terror. Amara was going to leave him, he insisted, tears streaming down his face. She was scared of him. He was tracking her, controlling her. We were going to go away together, to New York. She was finally ready to be free. "A convenient story, Mr. Reed," Donovan said, his voice flat. "But the evidence in your apartment tells a different one. It says you argued, you killed her, and you tried to make it look like a gang hit." Donovan felt the satisfying click of a case falling into place. He had a suspect, motive, and physical evidence. It was enough for a warrant, an indictment, and almost certainly a conviction. He could close the file and move on. But Monroe stood in the corner of the observation room, watching Eli through the one-way glass. She wasn't looking at a killer. She was looking at a pawn, a man who had been expertly maneuvered into the center of the board, ready to be sacrificed. She saw the love for Amara in his eyes, the genuine pain that couldn't be faked. The case wasn't closed. It had just been locked shut, with the wrong man on the inside, and she suspected Julian Sinclair was holding the key. Elias Reed's desperation in the interrogation room solidified into a single, concrete claim. A rock-solid alibi. "I wasn't anywhere near her studio that night," he repeated, his voice hoarse from hours of questioning. "I was at Gravity Sound Studios in Decatur, producing a track for a singer. Her name is Maya. We were there from 7 p.m. until well after 3 a.m. The whole place has cameras. Check them, please." It was the plea of an innocent man, and it was verifiable. Donovan, despite his conviction, couldn't ignore a direct lead like that. He sent a detective out to Decatur to pull the security footage from the recording studio. The wait was tense. If the footage showed Eli at the studio, their entire case against him would implode. The call came 3 hours later. "The footage is gone, Vince," the detective reported, his voice tinged with confusion. The studio owner said their system glitched. The entire 8-hour block from that night is corrupted. Just a screen of static. He's never seen anything like it. Donovan slammed the phone down. Corrupted footage. How convenient for Mr. Reed. To him, it was just another piece of the puzzle. Eli, or one of his friends, a tech-savvy musician perhaps, had wiped the tapes. It screamed guilt. But to Monroe, it screamed the opposite. Think about it, Vince, she argued in the hallway outside the bullpen. Eli is a music producer, not a master hacker. Wiping a commercial security system remotely without leaving a trace? That takes a level of skill, a level of resources he doesn't have. This isn't a kid covering his tracks. This is a professional job. So, what are you saying? Donovan asked, exasperation creeping into his voice. The grieving husband hired a hacker to erase the alibi of the man who was sleeping with his wife before she was even killed? That's movie plot stuff, Monroe. It's not if he planned it, she shot back. What if Julian knew about Eli all along? What if he knew Amara was leaving? This wasn't a crime of passion. It was an execution, and this frame job is part of it. The argument was a clash of two generations of policing. Donovan saw the world in black and white, in probable cause and physical evidence. He trusted what he could see and touch, the spray paint, the drugs. Monroe saw the shades of gray, the digital ghosts, the psychological manipulation that didn't leave fingerprints. She knew that in the 21st century, the most damning evidence wasn't always something you could hold in your hand. Frustrated but unable to completely dismiss Monroe's logic, Donovan agreed to let her dig. It was a long shot, but the corrupted footage was a loose thread, and his case was only strong as long as no one pulled on it. Monroe started with the anonymous tip that had led them to Eli. Payphones were dinosaurs, largely untraceable, but she got lucky. The MARTA station payphone was across the street from a bank with a high-resolution ATM camera pointing directly at it. After hours of reviewing footage, she found him. At 8:17 a.m. the day after the murder, a man in a nondescript hoodie and baseball cap used the phone. He kept his head down, but for a split second, as he turned to leave, he glanced up. The image was grainy, but the man's profile, the set of his jaw. It was unmistakably Julian Sinclair. She felt a jolt, a mixture of triumph and dread. She brought the still image to Donovan. He stared at it for a long minute, his jaw tight. It's circumstantial, Monroe. Any defense attorney would tear it apart. He was making a call. It's a blurry photo of a man who looks like him. But we know it's him, she pressed. And we know that call sent us on a wild goose chase that led us to a perfectly framed suspect whose alibi just happened to vanish into thin air. There are no coincidences this big, Vince. Not in a murder case. Donovan didn't answer. He just stood, staring at the grainy photo of the city's golden boy standing at a grimy payphone, orchestrating a narrative of lies. The neat little box he had put the case in was beginning to break apart at the seams. For the first time, he allowed himself to consider the terrifying possibility that Monroe was right. The man they were supposed to be protecting, the victim of the tragedy, could very well be the author of it. The foundation of his case wasn't just fractured, it was turning to dust. The grainy ATM photo was the crack in the dam. It was enough for Monroe to convince Donovan to authorize a deep dive, a quiet, off-the-books look into the digital life of a man who was, for all public purposes, a grieving victim. They couldn't get a warrant based on a blurry picture, so they had to be smart. They brought in Detective Kenji Tanaka from the Cybercrimes Unit, a quiet genius who saw the world in lines of code and data packets. If Julian Sinclair wanted to erase that footage and frame Eli Reed, he wouldn't have used his own computer, Tanaka explained, his fingers flying across a keyboard in his darkened office. He's too smart for that. He'd use burner phones, public Wi-Fi, VPNs, proxies. He'd create a ghost. So how do we catch a ghost? Donovan asked, feeling like a relic in this new world of digital warfare. Ghosts leave trails, Tanaka said with a thin smile. You just have to know where to look. Their first target was the corrupted security system at Gravity Sound Studios. Tanaka, working with the studio's IT manager, found the digital point of entry. The hack wasn't a glitch, it was a surgical strike. A malicious code had been remotely injected into the system, targeting and erasing a specific block of time before self-destructing. It was elegant, professional, and almost untraceable. Almost. The hacker used a multi-layered VPN to bounce his signal across 3 different continents, Tanaka explained, pointing to a complex map on his screen. But for a split second, during the initial handshake with the studio's server, the primary encryption faltered. It left a digital fingerprint, an IP address that resolved to a public library in Midtown Atlanta. It was the break they needed. They now had a physical location. They pulled the library's security footage for the night of the hack. After hours of scanning, they found him. The same hooded figure from the ATM camera, sitting at a public computer terminal for precisely 12 minutes. The exact duration of the cyber attack. He never looked up, but his posture, his movements, it was a match. The second trail was financial. If Julian had hired a professional, he would have had to pay them. Tanaka theorized he wouldn't use a credit card or a bank transfer. He'd use cryptocurrency, the currency of the digital underworld. This was Monroe's territory. Posing as someone looking for a discrete data solution on a few dark web forums, she learned about a notorious hacker for hire known only as Nix. Nix was known for 2 things, being a ghost and being expensive. The pieces began to fit. Julian, the politician, would want the best. Working backward, Tanaka's team began hunting for large, anonymous cryptocurrency transactions that occurred in the hours following the hack. They found one, a transfer of 10 Bitcoin, a small fortune, from a newly created digital wallet to a wallet known to be associated with Nix. Now for the hard part, Tanaka said, finding out who funded the initial wallet. They traced the wallet's origin. It had been loaded with cash via a crypto ATM at a 24-hour convenience store in a different part of the city. More security footage. This time, the man was wearing a different disguise, a delivery driver's uniform, complete with a hat and sunglasses, even though it was nearly midnight. But he made a mistake. As he fed the bills into the machine, he pulled a handkerchief from his pocket to wipe his brow. For a fraction of a second, his wrist was exposed. On it was a very distinctive, very expensive timepiece, a Breitling Navy timer, the same watch Julian Sinclair was photographed wearing at a charity gala just a week earlier. Donovan stared at the freeze frame on the monitor. The watch was a beacon in the grainy footage. It was an arrogant mistake, the kind of slip-up a man who believed he was smarter than everyone else would make. "He built a fortress of lies, Vince," Monroe said, her voice quiet but firm. "But he forgot to lock one of the doors." The digital ghost now had a face, a name, and a very expensive watch. They still didn't have enough to prove he was the one in Amara's studio, covered in her blood. But they had proven something just as damning. Julian Sinclair was not a victim. He was a puppeteer, a man who had meticulously crafted a conspiracy to destroy one man's life to cover up the ending of another. The hunt was no longer for a killer in the shadows of the streets. It was for a monster hiding in plain sight. The digital evidence was a bombshell, but it was circumstantial. It proved Julian was a conspirator, a manipulator, but it didn't place him at the scene of the crime. A good defense lawyer would argue he was merely trying to frame his wife's lover out of grief-stricken rage after the fact. They needed something physical, something that tied Julian directly to the violence in that studio. They needed to go back to the beginning. "There's something about the crime scene that's been bothering me," Monroe said, pacing in front of the evidence board. "The smell. Forensics said it was paint and turpentine, but I smelled something else, something clean, like bleach or ammonia." "The place was a mess of chemicals, Monroe." "She was an artist," Donovan countered. "No, this was different. It was the smell of something being erased," she insisted. "Like someone tried to scrub the place clean, and the paint smell just covered it up." It was a long shot, a hunch based on a fleeting sensory memory. But it was all they had. Donovan made a call that was met with skepticism and a heavy sigh, but he got his authorization. He was sending a K9 unit back to the Gilded Cage. Not a cadaver dog or a drug dog, but a specialist, a chemical detection dog. They met the handler, a stern woman named Officer Chen, and her partner, a magnificent German shepherd named Kodiak, outside the sealed warehouse. The air inside was stale now, the initial chemical scent having faded into a dusty memory. "What are we looking for exactly?" Chen asked, her hand resting on Kodiak's head. "The ghost of a smell," Monroe replied. "A strong cleaning agent, something that doesn't belong in an art studio. Chen gave her a dubious look but nodded. Kodiak, such, she commanded, the German word for seek. The dog went to work. He moved with a focus that was almost unnerving, his nose twitching, cataloging the millions of scent particles in the room. He ignored the dried bloodstains, the paint, the turpentine. He was on a different mission. He swept the room twice, his tail low, and for a moment, Donovan thought the hunch was a bust. Then Kodiak stopped. He was in the center of the room, near where Amara's body had been found. He wasn't barking or whining. He was just standing perfectly still, his head cocked, his nose pointed not at the floor, but at a small circular metal grate, a floor vent for the building's ancient HVAC system. He pawed at it once, then looked back at Chen. Donovan's heart began to pound. He and Monroe pried the grate open. The inside of the duct was dark and coated with a layer of grime. Using a flashlight, Monroe peered inside. At first she saw nothing but cobwebs, then a glint of latex. Carefully, using a pair of evidence tongs, she reached in and pulled out the object. It was a pair of black latex gloves, tightly bundled together. They were damp and reeked of a powerful industrial cleaning chemical. Tucked inside the bundle was something else, a small, dark-colored fabric swatch, no bigger than a postage stamp, that looked like it had been torn from a piece of heavy-duty clothing. "The killer cleaned up," Donovan said, his voice a whisper. "He wore gloves, scrubbed the scene, then ditched them down the vent where no one would ever think to look. But Kodiak did," Monroe said, her eyes shining with respect for the dog. This was the physical link they had been desperate for. The gloves would be a treasure trove for the forensics lab. They might hold traces of the killer's DNA on the inside, the victim's DNA on the outside, and a sample of the specific chemical used. The torn piece of fabric was a bonus, a potential link to the clothes the killer was wearing. As they bagged the evidence, Monroe noticed something else on the dusty floor around the vent. Faint outlines, almost invisible. She took out her phone and angled the light. They were shoe prints, but not from a sneaker or a boot. They were from a high-end leather dress shoe, the kind a man would wear with a suit. The killer hadn't been a gang member in tennis shoes. He had been someone dressed for success. The smell of a lie had led them to the truth. Julian Sinclair hadn't just orchestrated a digital frame-up from afar. He had been there. He had stood over his wife's body, and then, with cold, meticulous precision, he had tried to scrub his presence, his sin, from the face of the earth. But he hadn't counted on the ghost of a smell, and he certainly hadn't counted on the relentless, infallible nose of a German shepherd named Kodiak. The evidence from the air vent sent a shockwave through the investigation. The forensics lab went into overdrive. The results came back faster than Donovan had ever seen. Each new piece of data, a nail in Julian Sinclair's coffin. First, the gloves. The exterior was a microscopic nightmare of evidence. Traces of Amara's blood and DNA were present as expected. But mingled with it was the specific chemical signature of Clean Sweep Pro, an industrial-grade solvent used for removing biohazardous materials. It wasn't something you could buy at a hardware store. The lab report noted it was sold exclusively to licensed commercial cleaning companies. Second, the fabric swatch. It was a piece of high-density nylon, dyed a specific charcoal gray. The lab ran it through their textile database. It matched the material used in a line of high-end, Italian-made coveralls, the kind used by forensic cleaning crews, or perhaps by someone wanting to look the part. Third, and most damning, was the DNA from the inside of the gloves. Despite the chemical saturation, the lab managed to isolate a partial profile from skin cells left behind. It wasn't enough for a 100% match without a sample from the suspect, but it was enough to exclude Elias Reed and, crucially, to match the familial markers of a known profile in the system, Julian's own father, who had been in the military. It was a statistical probability so high, it was practically a certainty. The DNA belonged to Julian Sinclair. While the lab worked its magic, Monroe and Tanaka were chasing down the loose ends that would slam the door shut. Tanaka, armed with the knowledge of the Clean Sweep Pro chemical, started cross-referencing city contracts. He found it. Sinclair Enterprises, Julian's family real estate company, had an exclusive contract for their downtown office buildings with a single commercial cleaning service, Apex Janitorial. Apex was one of only 3 distributors of Clean Sweep Pro in the entire state of Georgia. Monroe took a different approach. She was fixated on the coveralls. It seemed too elaborate. Why would Julian buy a professional set of coveralls for a single murder? Unless he hadn't. She went back to Julian's public appearances, scouring photos from the past year. She found it in an article from 6 months prior. Julian, the community activist, posing for a photo op with a city-funded cleanup crew, helping them remove graffiti. In the photo, he was wearing a set of charcoal gray coveralls, a proud smile on his face as he held a pressure washer. It was a PR stunt, but he had kept the uniform. He had hidden the perfect murder weapon in plain sight, in his own closet, a souvenir from a day he pretended to be a man of the people. The final piece of the puzzle came from Tanaka, who had never stopped digging into the hacker, Nix. While he couldn't legally access the hacker's files, he had set up alerts. Nix, it turned out, was as arrogant as his client. He bragged on a private encrypted forum about a recent job, mocking his amateur politician client. He posted a heavily redacted snippet of their initial communication as proof of his prowess. In the middle of the redacted text was a single, unredacted phrase Julian had written. The objective is to create a terminal narrative for ER following the event. Terminal narrative. It was cold, corporate, inhuman language. The language of a man who didn't see people, only objectives and assets. Donovan laid it all out on the big board in the squad room. The crypto transaction linked to the watch. The library footage linked to the ATM footage. The chemical linked to the company contract. The coveralls linked to the PR photo. The DNA linked to his family. The email snippet confirming the plan. It was a web of evidence so tight, so intricate, that there was no escape. Julian Sinclair's biggest mistake wasn't the watch, or the chemical, or the gloves. It was his own hubris. He believed he was so intelligent, so meticulous, that he could build the perfect crime. He constructed an elaborate machine of deceit, with each part designed to work flawlessly. But he was the architect, the financier, the hacker's client, and the man on the ground. He had played every role, and in doing so, he had left a piece of himself at every stage of the conspiracy. He had planned for everything except the dogged persistence of a detective who trusted a dog's nose, and the arrogant slip-ups of a man who believed he was untouchable. "It's time," Donovan said, grabbing his jacket. "Let's go talk to the man of the year." The second time they entered Julian Sinclair's house, it was with a warrant, not an invitation. The air of performative grief was gone, replaced by a chilling stillness. Julian was waiting for them in his minimalist living room, his lawyer by his side. He wasn't panicked or angry. He was calm. It was the most unnerving thing Donovan had ever seen. "Detective Donovan, Officer Monroe," Julian said, his voice smooth as polished marble. "To what do I owe this intrusion? I assume you're here to give me an update on the man who murdered my wife." Donovan didn't bother with pleasantries. He laid a series of evidence photos on the glass coffee table. The still from the ATM camera, the watch on the wrist at the crypto machine, the latex gloves, the lab report on the industrial cleaner. Julian glanced at them with mild curiosity, as if reviewing a business proposal. "This is all very dramatic, detective, but it's circumstantial. You have nothing." "We have the DNA from inside the gloves, Julian," Monroe said, her voice steady. "It matches yours." For the first time, a flicker of something crossed Julian's face. Not fear, annoyance. The lawyer began to speak, citing rights and procedures, but Julian held up a hand, silencing him. He leaned back on the sofa, a slow, cold smile spreading across his face. The mask didn't just slip. He tore it off and threw it aside. "You're both more clever than I gave you credit for," he said, his tone shifting from that of a victim to that of a CEO evaluating his staff. "I suppose a confession would streamline the process?" Donovan and Monroe exchanged a stunned look. They had come prepared for a fight, for denials and legal maneuvering. They were not prepared for this. "Why, Julian?" Donovan asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Why would you do it?" Julian sighed, a sound of profound impatience. "Why? Because she became an inconvenience, a liability." He spoke about Amara not as a person, but as a component in the machinery of his ambition. She was perfect at first, the talented, tragic artist. It played beautifully with my image. It softened my edges. She was an excellent asset. He stood up and began to pace, his movements precise and controlled. But then she started to believe her own press. She wanted to publish her little book of poems, to go on tour, to have a voice. She was planning to leave me, just as the campaign was entering its crucial phase. A rising political star being left by his wife? The media would have a field day. It would make me look weak, unstable. I couldn't allow it. There was no rage in his voice, no jealousy, no hint of a broken heart. There was only the cold, hard logic of a cost-benefit analysis. "So you killed her," Monroe said, her voice thick with revulsion. "I managed a crisis," Julian corrected her. "Her death, when properly framed, was far more valuable to my career than her continued existence. A tragic widower, galvanized into action by his wife's senseless murder at the hands of the very elements he's vowed to fight. It's a powerful narrative, a king-making narrative. The donations, the public sympathy, the numbers have been extraordinary." He paused and looked directly at them, his eyes empty of everything but a terrifying self-assurance. "I didn't kill her because of Elias Reed. I used him. He was the perfect patsy. A cliché. The troubled artist from the wrong side of the tracks. It was a story everyone was ready to believe. You," he said, pointing a finger at Donovan, "were certainly ready to believe it." The confession was a masterclass in malignant narcissism. He wasn't confessing to a crime. He was boasting about a successful project. He had seen a problem, his wife's burgeoning independence, and he had engineered a solution that not only eliminated the problem but also produced a net benefit for his primary objective, his own rise to power. "You didn't just kill her," Donovan said, his voice shaking with a rage he hadn't felt in years. "You tried to erase her. You tried to twist her memory into a lie." Julian actually smiled, a genuine, chilling smile. "She was a poet, detective. She dealt in fiction. I simply wrote her final chapter. A much more impactful one, I think you'll agree." As the uniformed officers came in to place him under arrest, Julian remained serene. He adjusted his cuffs, smoothed his suit jacket, and walked out of his perfect sterile house without a single backward glance. He hadn't been unmasked as a monster. In his own mind, he had simply been revealed for the brilliant strategist he had always known himself to be. And in the silence of that cold, gray room, Donovan and Monroe were left to grapple with a truth far more terrifying than any crime of passion. The evil they had been hunting was not born of emotion, but from its complete and utter absence. The trial of Julian Sinclair was more than a legal proceeding. It was a public exorcism. The city of Atlanta, which had so readily embraced him as a hero, was now forced to confront the monster it had nearly elected. The courtroom was a circus. Media from across the country packed the galleries, their cameras trained on the man who had fallen so spectacularly from grace. Julian's defense team tried to paint him as a man driven mad by grief, concocting an elaborate fantasy after the fact to cope with his wife's death at the hands of Elias Reed. They argued the confession was coerced from a fragile mind. It was a valiant effort, but it crumbled under the mountain of evidence Monroe and Donovan had painstakingly assembled. The prosecution, led by a sharp assistant district attorney, laid out the case with brutal precision. Kenji Tanaka testified about the digital ghost, explaining the VPNs, the crypto transactions, and the irrefutable link to the library computer. The K-9 handler, Officer Chen, described how Kodiak had found the gloves. The forensic experts detailed the DNA, the chemical solvent, and the fabric match. But the most powerful moments came from those who had truly known Amara. Her friends from the art collective took the stand, their voices shaking with grief and anger as they described the vibrant woman Julian had tried to suffocate. They spoke of her talent, her fire, and her fear. The trial's emotional climax came when Elias Reed testified. He was a free man now, exonerated of all charges, but his ordeal was etched on his face. He didn't speak with anger, but with a profound sadness. He described his love for Amara, their shared dreams of a life in New York, and the excitement in her voice on their last day together. Then, the prosecutor asked him to read a poem. It was the last one Amara had written, found in a notebook in her studio. Elias's voice, at first trembling, grew stronger as he read her words. The poem was titled Unfinished Symphony. It spoke of shattered cages, of learning to fly on mended wings, of a love that was not about ownership, but about freedom. The courtroom was silent, spellbound. For those few minutes, Amara Sinclair was alive again, her voice filling the space, telling her own story in a way no evidence ever could. Julian watched it all with the same detached curiosity he had shown since his arrest. He seemed to be observing a play, not a trial for his own life. He never flinched, never showed remorse. His emptiness was more damning than any outburst could have been. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. The verdict was a formality. Guilty on all counts: murder in the first degree, conspiracy, tampering with evidence, and obstruction of justice. The judge, in his sentencing, called Julian's actions a crime of breathtaking arrogance and profound moral depravity. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As he was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, Julian caught Donovan's eye. He didn't look defeated. He looked bored. The game was over and he had lost. That was all. Outside the courthouse, Elias Reed was surrounded by Amara's friends. They were crying, but they were also smiling. It wasn't a victory because nothing could bring her back, but it was justice. It was a reclaiming of her narrative. Donovan and Monroe stood on the steps, watching the crowd. The media was already proclaiming them heroes, the detectives who had unmasked the monster. But neither of them felt heroic. They had simply followed the evidence, one pulling on the threads of the physical world, the other on the ghosts of the digital one. They had delivered one kind of justice, the kind the law provides. But they knew another kind of justice was taking place right there, on the courthouse steps. As Amara's friends began to plan a memorial, a poetry reading, a celebration of the life that had been stolen. The legal system had punished her killer, but it would be her friends, her art, and her words that would ensure her symphony, though unfinished, would never truly be silenced. Weeks after the trial, a fragile autumn settled over Atlanta. The leaves on the trees in Grant Park turned to rust and gold, and a chill in the air seemed to carry a city's collective sigh of relief. The Julian Sinclair scandal was fading from the headlines, replaced by new dramas, new politics. In his cramped office, Detective Vince Donovan stared at the case file on his desk, the words "closed" stamped in bold red ink. For most cases, that stamp brought a sense of finality, of a job done. This time, it felt inadequate. He had put the killer behind bars, but he couldn't shake the memory of his own initial conviction. He had looked at the graffiti, the drugs, the victim's address, and he had written his own neat, prejudiced story. He had seen a young black woman and immediately assumed she was a victim of the streets, not of the man she shared a home with. If it hadn't been for Monroe, for her refusal to accept the easy answer, a monster might have made it to City Hall, and an innocent man would have rotted in prison. The case had taught him a humbling, uncomfortable lesson. The most dangerous biases are the ones you don't even know you have. The door creaked open and Gabrielle Monroe leaned in. "You busy?" "Just thinking," he grunted, gesturing for her to come in. She sat down, a small flyer in her hand. "I was just at the Gilded Cage," she said. "Elias and her friends, they're turning her studio into a small gallery, a permanent exhibition of her work." She pushed the flyer across the desk. It was for the grand opening. The centerpiece was a photo of Amara, not smiling for a camera, but laughing, mid-dance, her face a portrait of pure, unadulterated joy. The event was titled The Unfinished Symphony, The Art and Voice of Amara Sinclair. Her book of poetry is being published next spring, Monroe added, the one he tried to stop. Elias is using the advance to set up a foundation in her name, to help young, at-risk artists. Donovan looked at the flyer, then at Monroe. "He tried to erase her," he said quietly, "and instead, he made her immortal." "You can't kill an idea, Vince," she replied. "You can't murder a voice. You can only silence it for a little while." That evening, Donovan found himself driving to the old Fourth Ward. He didn't go to the gallery opening. He just parked across the street, watching as people, all ages, all races, filed into the old warehouse. He could hear the faint sound of music and laughter spilling out into the cool night air. The building was no longer a crime scene. It was a beacon, alive with the very energy Julian had tried so hard to extinguish. The case had begun with a brutal, calculated act of evil, born from an obsession with control and image. Julian believed that by killing Amara, he could control her story, make her a footnote in his own. But he had failed to understand the fundamental nature of art, of love, of the human spirit. These things have their own momentum. A story once told cannot be untold. A song once sung echoes forever. As he drove home through the glittering lights of the city, Donovan understood the final lesson of the case. True evil isn't always a raging fire. Sometimes it's a quiet, cold vacuum, an absence of empathy that sees people as objects to be managed or discarded. But the counterforce to that vacuum isn't just justice or handcuffs. It's a poem read in a quiet room, a painting that makes a stranger feel something, a community that refuses to let a beautiful soul be forgotten. It's the lingering echoes of a symphony that, even when left unfinished, can still change the world.